They say trust is everything in a jail, but what happens when that trust is betrayed in the most dramatic way imaginable? In a small county jail in Florence, Alabama, a corrections officer named Vicky White rose through the ranks. She wasn't rough or harsh. People said she treated inmates with kindness. She had worked there many years, and she was viewed as a steady, thoughtful leader. Her co-workers trusted her deeply. Then came Casey Cole White, a very large man with a long prison record. He was accused of murder, and he was in jail awaiting a very serious trial. He was no ordinary inmate. Sometime around 2020, people say that Vicky and Casey began what investigators later called a special relationship. According to the sheriff, they first made contact then, and even when Casey was moved to a different prison, she kept calling him on the phone. To many, it must have looked impossible. A corrections officer, respected and by the book, connecting with a prisoner charged with capital murder. But according to Vicky's coworkers, she was never the loud or dramatic type. She stayed quiet, but something deep was changing. Then came April 29th, 2022, the day no one in Lauderdale County would ever forget. That morning, Vicky told her fellow officers that she was taking Casey to the courthouse for a mental health evaluation. There was no second officer with her, even though the rules said there should have been at least 2 deputies when transporting an inmate like him. Surveillance showed Casey, handcuffed and shackled, climbing into Vicky's patrol car. She drove him out of the jail, but not to a courtroom. Instead, something far more planned was unfolding. Vicky did not return to the jail that day. That same afternoon, her patrol car was discovered abandoned in a nearby parking lot. The news spread fast. A manhunt began. For 11 days, Vicky and Casey were on the run. Authorities behind them scrambled, calling in local, state, and federal law enforcement to help. Vicky had quietly prepared before disappearing. According to investigators, she sold her home. She withdrew nearly $90,000 from the bank. She bought a car using a different name. Everything seemed calculated, as if she had planned this escape for months. To many outside, it seemed unbelievable that she would do this. She had always been reliable, caring, someone who could de-escalate fights in the jail. And yet, the same person who once risked her life for others had now risked everything for one man. During the manhunt, officials revealed more about their relationship. It wasn't just professional. According to the sheriff, there had been nearly 1,000 phone calls between them in the months before the escape. Those calls weren't just about legal matters, investigators later said. They spoke of something deeper, more personal. As the days passed, clues came in. Surveillance video captured Vicky's car at a gas station with Casey. The two changed cars, moved between states, and tried to stay hidden. It was a chase, but not just a chase for a criminal. It was a chase for a secret. Finally, authorities zeroed in on them in Evansville, Indiana. A police officer spotted a vehicle matching Vicky's description outside a motel. They approached, and that's when things turned tragic. The car sped off, leading to a short pursuit. Then, in a field, the vehicle flipped into a ditch. Casey surrendered without further violence. But Vicky, she was found with a gunshot wound to her head. She was rushed to a nearby hospital but died soon after. Authorities would later rule her death a suicide. When the news finally settled, the nation was stunned. A trusted corrections officer had helped a man she was supposed to lock away. And in doing so, she destroyed her career and her life. In the courtroom later, Casey made a powerful statement. He said he loved Vicky. He said she was the only person in years who showed him kindness, someone who believed in him when no one else did. As for their relationship, no one will ever know exactly how deep it went. Some think Vicky truly loved him. Others believe she was manipulated. But by April 29, 2022, she made a choice that changed everything. In just a few hours, she walked out of the jail with him. They drove off into uncertainty. 11 days later, that journey ended in tragedy. Now, her family mourns. Her co-workers wonder how she planned it all. And the world asks, why? Why did a woman with everything to lose risk it all for a man behind bars? That question haunts their story, and it's only the beginning. The manhunt for Vicky White and Casey White had become the biggest story in Alabama. It wasn't just a local case anymore. News stations across the country were watching. Every sheriff, every reporter, every person online wanted to know one thing. How could this have happened? Inside the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office, the mood was heavy. Officers who had worked with Vicky for years kept shaking their heads, trying to understand how someone so calm, so trusted, could simply vanish with a dangerous inmate. Some officers were angry. Some were heartbroken. Some refused to believe she had done it willingly. They kept saying, "There must be a mistake. Someone forced her." But as the days passed, the truth soon became harder to deny. Search teams spread across fields, forests, highways, and small towns. Helicopters flew overhead. Officers checked every lead, every tip, and every camera they could find. On the wall of the command center, investigators pinned up a growing map, lines, photos, circles, arrows. Every new clue made the picture bigger, but it did not make it clearer. Meanwhile, far away from the frantic search, Vicky and Casey were quietly moving north. They switched cars. They changed clothes. They stayed away from crowded places. And most importantly, they stayed unseen. But even on the run, danger followed them everywhere. Casey was a man with a violent history, accused of murder and already serving time for other crimes. People feared what he could do if cornered. But strangely, during these days on the run, he didn't act like the monster many expected. He stayed hidden. He followed Vicky's lead. And he trusted her completely. In those 11 days, they lived a life that almost didn't feel real. They stayed in cheap hotels under fake names. They bought food quietly and left quickly. They drove long stretches of road without speaking much. They both knew every minute was borrowed time. But something else was happening, too. Something that only the two of them understood. Vicky, who had always appeared strong and steady, now carried a weight so heavy it almost crushed her. She had crossed a line she could never step back over. She had left her job, her home, her friends, her reputation. Everything she had built in her life was now slipping away like sand through fingers. And Casey, even he sensed it. He watched her hands tremble sometimes when she drove. He saw the look in her eyes when she heard sirens in the distance. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear of him. It was the fear of what she had become. But no matter what she felt inside, Vicky kept moving. She planned. She paid for things in cash. She scouted routes before they drove them. She told Casey when to duck, when to wait, and when to walk. If there was one thing certain during their time on the run, it was this: Vicky was in control. To the outside world, the story sounded almost unbelievable. A respected corrections officer loving an inmate, it sounded like something out of a movie. But real life is not a movie. Real life can be confusing, messy, and full of decisions no one ever expects someone to make. Back in Alabama, the sheriff spoke on camera almost every day. His voice grew more tired as the search continued. He said he trusted her once. He said she was the best employee he had. He said he didn't know this side of her. And he said he believed she was in danger, either from Casey or from her own choices. Across the country, people debated her motives. Some said she was manipulated. Some said she fell in love. Some said she reached a breaking point after years of loneliness. Nobody knew for sure, but everyone had an opinion. Meanwhile, their trail, though faint, was still discoverable. Surveillance cameras in small towns caught glimpses of the couple. A car left behind was traced back to Vicky. Banks reported her large cash withdrawals from weeks earlier. And slowly, law enforcement began to put the pieces together. By the 7th day, federal agencies had joined the hunt. Teams searched everywhere from Alabama to Tennessee to Kentucky. And yet, Vicky and Casey stayed one step ahead. But hiding forever is impossible. On the 10th day, they made a quiet mistake. They checked into a motel in Evansville, Indiana. It wasn't a fancy place. It wasn't even a busy place. But the motel manager noticed something odd: a large man, tall and hard to miss, sitting in a car outside for long stretches of time. The manager thought it looked suspicious enough to mention to the police. It wasn't a direct match. It wasn't perfect. But the officer who heard it decided to look anyway. Sometimes, the smallest tip becomes the biggest break. On the morning of the 11th day, officers spotted a vehicle linked to Vicky. They watched it from a distance, waiting for confirmation. Then the doors opened, and the couple walked out. The chase began in an instant. Blue lights flashed. Sirens wailed. The car sped away. Inside the vehicle, Vicky gripped the wheel tightly. Casey sat beside her, no longer the one in control. He later said he told her to surrender. He later said he didn't want her to get hurt. But by then, the situation had grown too big, too fast, and too frightening for her to stop. The car raced down the road, losing control in the chaos. It crashed into a ditch. Officers surrounded the scene. Casey stepped out first, hands raised, shouting for help. Inside the overturned car, Vicky lay still. The officers rushed to her. They broke the window. They pulled her out carefully. They carried her to an ambulance. But the moment they saw her injury, they knew it was serious. As the lights of the ambulance flashed across the field, Casey shouted that he didn't want her to die. He shouted that she deserved better. He shouted that he loved her. But the road, the choices, the fear, everything had pushed the story toward a place it could not turn back from. When doctors finally gave the report, the news spread fast. Vicky White had died in the hospital. The chase was over. The escape was over. And the story, which started with a quiet woman and a dangerous inmate, had turned into one of the most shocking cases in modern prison history. Back in Alabama, her co-workers cried. Her family struggled to make sense of her decisions. The sheriff called it a tragic end to a troubled story. People around the country debated everything: her motives, her feelings, her choices, her fate. But one thing stood above all the arguments. No one expected Vicky White, of all people, to end her life this way. And as Casey was returned to prison in chains once again, one question echoed through every courtroom, every news station, every conversation. How did a respected officer fall into a story like this? And why did it cost her everything? That question, still unanswered, forms the heart of what happened next. Because what followed after her death, what Casey confessed, what investigators uncovered, would reveal a side of the story the world had never seen before. And it would change the way people remembered her forever. After the crash in Indiana, after the sirens faded and the dust settled, the country was left with more questions than answers. Casey White was alive, handcuffed, and taken back into custody. But Vicky White, the woman everyone once trusted, was gone. And because she could no longer speak for herself, the world turned its attention to the only person left who truly knew what had happened: Casey. The moment he stepped back inside a jail, reporters surrounded the courthouse. Cameras waited outside every entrance. Everyone wanted the same things: answers, explanations, reasons. But inside the holding cell, Casey sat quietly, staring at the floor, as though lost in a world only he could see. Some officers refused to speak to him. Some glared at him as they walked by. Some blamed him directly. They believed he had manipulated her. They believed he had destroyed her life. They believed he had ruined everything she once was. But when investigators finally sat across from him, recording devices on, notebooks open, he said something no one expected. He said that during the chase, he begged her to stop. He said he told her they wouldn't win. He said he didn't want her to get hurt. To some, his words sounded like guilt. To others, they sounded like regret. And to many, they sounded like a man trying to rewrite a story already set in stone. But the police didn't argue. They let him talk. They wanted to hear everything. Casey told them about the months leading up to the escape. He said Vicky brought him special meals, allowed extra privileges, and treated him with unusual kindness. He said she talked to him like a real person, not an animal like other officers sometimes did. He said she looked lonely. He said she looked tired. And he said she listened when he talked about his life. One day, she asked him about his childhood. Another day, she asked if he trusted her. Later, she said she wanted to help him. A bond formed. A friendship became something deeper. And then came a plan. Casey swore it wasn't his idea. He said Vicky planned every step. He said she was the leader, not him. Still, many people doubted his story. Casey was a man accused of murder, a man with a violent history. And now he was talking about Vicky as if she were the mastermind behind everything. But the evidence didn't disagree. She sold her house. She withdrew her savings. She bought a getaway car. She bought clothes in larger sizes for Casey. She even pretended she was taking him to a mental evaluation, a trip that never existed. The more investigators uncovered, the more they realized. She really did plan it. Every detail, every step, every lie, it all pointed back to her. Still, knowing the facts didn't make the story easier to accept. For detectives and co-workers who had known her for years, the hardest part was imagining how someone who had spent her entire career catching criminals could suddenly choose to become one. Psychologists later studied the case. Some said it looked like emotional burnout. Others said workplace isolation. Others suggested a sudden attachment formed under stress. But no one could agree on a single explanation. How does a respected officer risk everything? How does a trusted leader throw away a perfect record? How does a quiet woman walk into a jail one morning and leave as a fugitive? The truth was simple. No one knew the full story because one half of that story was gone. Still, investigators continued digging. They found video footage of Casey and Vicky inside the car on the day of the escape. They found receipts from stores, motel check-ins, and items they bought while running. They traced every move, but those clues only showed what happened, not why. To find the why, they searched Vicky's home, her computer, her phone. They read her messages, looked at her browser history, checked bank records. They found no secret accomplices, no dark hidden life. They found only a woman who seemed lonely, a woman who seemed tired, a woman who suddenly decided she wanted something different. Her coworkers said she had talked about retiring soon. They remembered she had mentioned being ready for a new life somewhere quiet. She had even joked about disappearing to the beach one day. But none of them ever expected those jokes to become real. As the investigation continued, Casey was moved to a high-security prison. He was placed under strict conditions, no direct contact with staff, extra monitoring, and limited movement. The escape changed everything about the way they handled him. But after a few weeks, something strange happened. Casey asked to speak to investigators again. He wasn't asking for a deal. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He just wanted to talk. What he said surprised even the most experienced detectives. He said he cared about Vicky deeply. He said she treated him like a human being when others didn't. He said she believed he deserved another chance at life. He described moments that no one else had seen, small things. A conversation through a cell door. A joke she made that made him laugh. The way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching. He talked about her as if she were the only bright part of his day. And he said that when they were free together, during those 11 days on the run, she looked happier than he had ever seen her before. She was smiling, he said, more than she ever did at the jail. The detectives wrote down his words, even though they knew his version of the story might not be the whole truth. But they weren't just interrogating him. They were trying to understand a puzzle that would never be complete. Soon afterward, Casey was charged with escape and other crimes connected to the getaway. 2 years later, he received decades added to his already long prison sentence. His time outside had lasted only 11 days. But for Vicky, it had cost everything. As the case closed, news reporters still tried to make sense of what happened. Some used dramatic headlines. Others focused on the love story. Some blamed Casey. Some blamed Vicky. Some blamed the prison system itself. But the real story was quiet, sad, and complicated. A woman who had spent her life helping others became trapped in her own loneliness. A man already trapped in prison found the one connection he didn't expect. And together, they made a choice that changed both of their lives forever. Now, years later, the case remains one of the most shocking escapes in American history, not because it was violent, not because it was elaborate, but because of who was involved. People still ask the same questions. What made Vicky cross that line? What did she hope to find on the other side? And did she believe she could really outrun everything behind her? No one will ever know for sure. But the story left behind, filled with risk, fear, love, heartbreak, and choices that spiraled out of control, remains a warning about how even the strongest people can fall when life pushes them into the wrong place at the wrong time. And the saddest part? Vicky White was not a villain. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't evil. She was a person who made a mistake so big, she couldn't escape it, not even as she tried to run away. Today, Casey White remains in a prison cell, locked away for life. Sometimes, officers say, he sits quietly for long periods, saying nothing. Maybe thinking, maybe remembering, maybe regretting. No one knows. As for Vicky, she exists now only in stories, in news archives, in interviews, in questions people still ask. A respected officer, a trusted employee, a quiet woman who changed the course of her life in one morning shift. Her story ends in that field in Indiana, surrounded by officers who once admired her, with the world watching and wondering how it all happened. A story of escape, a story of love, a story of loss, a story the world will never forget. Subscribe for more videos like this.